Hello, everyone. You've been hearing a lot this morning about politics and psychology and history of conspiracies from the Middle Ages to now, and just recently of the specific beliefs about Judaism. Our topic this hour is one of enduring fascination to me, but also of really significant importance. We're going to talk about the spread of conspiracies from heretical groups to social media. So suppose I were to tell you that there was a small group of engineers who have figured out how to use technology to take advantage of our brain and our wiring and turn it against us. And then let's say that some of the world's most powerful men were involved in a conspiracy to cover up rampant sexual abuse for decades. So these beliefs you might recognize as being at the core of both actual realities of life, social media algorithms manipulating our beliefs and choices, which is true, and then the Catholic Church having covered up sexual abuse, which is true. But these same beliefs are at the center of two very dangerous false narratives. The spread, for example, of the spread of 5G technology, the idea that it's dangerous, which according to the NYPD has actually led to people in New York demolishing cell phone towers in recent months. And then of course the Pizzagate conspiracy that morphed into Q and QAnon. I wonder, among many other things, if it is easier to spread conspiracy theories than we think because they resemble things that we know or intuit to be true. Has the way that we've chosen to use technology engineered the permanent spread of conspiracy theories into the fundamental way that we relate to people? And what about trust? Do we believe weird things because the people we're supposed to trust can't be relied on? How can we, or can we at all, build consensus around a basic set of facts and values? So these are some of the questions I hope to get to, and we'll also have time to get to some of yours. The panel today is exceptional. Professor Sinan Aral is a global authority on business analytics, an award-winning researcher, a scientist, an entrepreneur, venture capitalist. He is the director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy and the David Austin Professor of Management, Marketing, IT, and Data Science at MIT. And his book, which is excellent and I commend it to you, The Hype Machine, How Social Media Disrupts Our Elections, Our Economy, and Our Health, and How We Must Adapt, explores how social media affects our decision-making and shapes our world, both useful and dangerous. And it has a lot of really practical ideas of how we can protect ourselves. Professor Christine Caldwell Ames teaches medieval European history at the University of South Carolina. She has a particular interest in the history of Christianity, heresy, and Inquisition, and interreligious relations. She has written 2 books on religious repression in the Middle Ages. And for some reason, the forthcoming book, Blood on the Vine, A Religious History of Wine in Medieval Europe, sounds particularly fascinating, examining the ways that wine influenced religious culture throughout society. Professor Mark Gregory Pegg is a professor of history at Washington University in St. Louis. He specializes in scholarship of the Crusades and the Inquisition, the history of heresy, and the history of holiness. And Professor Karen Douglas, who teaches social psychology at the University of Kent in the UK. She studies the antecedents and consequences of beliefs in conspiracy theories and serves on the executive committee of the European Association of Social Psychology and is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. So it's one of my favorite parts of moderating a panel. I get to read everyone's wonderful titles. I want to start with Professor Your book on medieval heresies discusses the belief in monotheistic traditions that a living God owned the truth, that a living God was angry when people ignored the truth, and that God would enact some sort of retribution on both those who refuse to believe the truth and also on society at large for the number of unbelievers who were left untouched in society. So what role at the time when there really wasn't a print or written culture did existential and mortal fear play in dividing the church between heretics and true believers?
I think fear is absolutely paramount in understandings of heresy, defining heresy, thinking about heresy, and then also in the manifestations of persecution on the ground in medieval Europe, which is mostly what I study and what I'm interested in. And that's something that I think is a really interesting point of comparison when we think about conspiracies in the Middle Ages and today, the questions of sort of what is really at stake and who is benefiting in the supposed conspiracy, but also who is being harmed. Because what we absolutely see in ecclesiastical churchmen's conceptions of medieval heresy is this idea of harm that you're alluding to. Again, fear that God can be offended, fear that God is going to, in a sense, sort of take personally these violations or turning away from the truth. There's this wonderful sense of kind of the interpenetration of individual Christian souls and the broader Christian community. And what that means is that it's not really possible to say, all right, you kind of believe your thing, you do your truth, and I'll do mine, because of this sense of this ultimate consequence of turning away from truth. It has a consequence for the individual soul, harm to the individual soul, but then if I let you believe something that is incorrect, something that is offending God, then that redounds back to me, and it can redound really throughout the entire community. And so I think absolutely notion of fear and notion of harm is completely pervasive and is making such a difference here.
So just to follow up on what catalyzed the hunt for heretics then? Because it's one thing to go from believing that we have a problem with heresy to actively starting to seek out and divide and segment heretics.
Well, I think if I can make a modern comparison, the question is simply, do we let people believe things that we think are bad for them and for society? And this is not simply a medieval dynamic. We talk about this in the modern West all the time. Beliefs that are simply unacceptable, beliefs that can't be withstood, either in an individual person or, again, the broader sort of interconnectedness of humans. And so I think that certainly in the Middle Ages is what drives a notion, the sort of absolute desire and mandate of pursuit. Again, if I think there's an evil in society, I, as well as a broader society, have an obligation to root it out. And so again, I think one of the really interesting points of comparison is we do accept this as a notion in the modern West, again, that some beliefs are simply unacceptable and must be rooted out. And so I think if we can sort of take that and then kind of reflect it back to the Middle Ages, that's a good way to get at medieval understandings of heresy. It has to be pursued because people have to be persuaded to believe something different. And the kind of persecution, again, that I study and that Mark studies as well, medieval inquisitions, they are fundamentally about persuading someone to believe differently, which I think, again, is really fascinating.
So to Professor Mark Pegg, let me go to you then. How did yours go from being concerned about heresy and finding heresy and categorizing it to literally burning heretics alive? Talk a little bit about the escalation of the persecution to that degree.
Well, that's a really great question, because it's, as I'm sure Christine would like to point out, it's also, I'm not about to make the early inquisitors, and the Inquisition, right, begins around 1230, 1231. I'm not about to make them cuddly, but the early inquisitors actually didn't burn people. They do burn people, but they only started burning them, 50 or 60 years later. That's important though. And then going back into the 12th century, where we first start getting this rising escalation within Latin Christendom, the West, of a fear of heresy, which really takes hold after, say, 1150. But before that, and this is why it's important to try and get across this, you're right, this question of escalation. How do we go from an accusation, which is all, really that's all it was in, say, 1140, 1150. We go from an accusation, really beginning in the schoolroom, right? The new universities, the new idea of it, people being learned, and this gets back to your question about technologies, if you like. It is the rise of the university. It's often an accusation that first begins amongst intellectuals, attacking each other, that they're not thinking correct, and so on. It then becomes an accusation that gets, if you like, leaves the schoolroom, and is often by preachers against lots of ordinary Christians, saying to them, well, look, you're not understanding what it is to be a Christian, because part of what's going on, I would argue, in the 12th century, is particularly the church, but also you could say some secular states, but the church trying to articulate what it is to be Christian. And that takes a lot of work. And in articulating what it is to be a Christian, you're also trying to articulate what it is not to be a Christian. And some of these ideas that we think are obvious take a lot of work, such as the idea that you should confess, or that there's questions of purgatory, or even a clear notion of the afterlife. And so a lot of ordinary Christians who think they're deeply Christian just don't get it. And so there's this accusation. And famously, speaking of conspiracies, we have like a preacher called Bernard Clairvaux who says something like, false ideas are like poison that enters the body like a cancer and eats people from within, and that's what heresy should understand it. But he also says the church has always had heretics, we can live with them. Jump forward a bit, we get to 1208, and a pope like Innocent III proclaims the first crusade of Christians against Christians in the Latin West, and that's against heretics in the lands of the Count of Toulouse, and says they should be eliminated. He even says they should be expunged, they should be wiped out, they should be eliminated from the... And I do think there's a kind of apocalypticism here, but there's really a sense that we go from an accusation that a lot of people dismiss, but it's certainly, it's even churchmen think, well, we can live with it, but, and then it's like we can't, but a lot of ordinary people just dismiss this accusation, and then say within 60 years, it becomes an argument for eliminating people, murdering people, massacring people. You know, it's one of these big debates, the first genocides in the West really associated with the Albigensian Crusade. I think there's an argument to me that can be, but anyhow, and so we go to that, and then you know, that war lasts 20 years, and then 2 years after that war ends, 1229, we have, you know, another pope called Gregory IX says the serpent of heresy has re-risen again, and that's where we get the Inquisitions. And they come in, particularly again, beginning in southern France, but then spreading out throughout Christendom, investigating, and as Christine quite rightly said, part of what they're doing is, in many ways, it's just pointing out to people things they thought were innocent, things they thought that they'd done all their lives that had no consequences, are now sins, are now signs of heresy. And in many ways, this is part of the sort of the powerful phenomenon of what we're talking about here. It really is the creation of a new sense of self in many ways, meaning that things you thought you did at the age of 10, say, that you thought had no consequences, that didn't relate to you as an adult, are now something that totally shapes you or makes you a sinner, and so forth and so on. And so there's a new creation of this idea of a confessional linear sense of self. But that's a really powerful model that means that things you thought, as I said, were innocent. And then as we go on further, what's even more, I find, fascinating and remarkable, and we could get back to, you could say, modern conspiracy theories, is that, let's say after 1250, a lot of people questioned by the Inquisition generally, if you like, want the violence of the Inquisition because they feel it makes them holy. That you can actually have someone in 1270, but I do remember this, someone says, there's nothing so beautiful as a death by fire, knowing that the Inquisition will question them and will burn them. No one talks like that in 1230s or 1240s. So within a relatively short, again, space of time, you have people self-consciously accepting that things they do or think might lead to their death or at least imprisonment. And therefore, there are people who've come to adopt the very thing they're being accused of, but they're also adopting the very thing that might kill them. And so do you see, I've given a very short, but you go from the idea of an accusation in the schoolroom, spreads out to other Christians trying to make, again, better Christians, think better, act better. It becomes an argument for warfare, for violence, for elimination. Then it flows into the Inquisitions. And then, and I do think, and that powerfully, then we move on into the 13th, 14th century. You could even say to Joan of Arc and 1431, where she's questioned by the Inquisition and so forth and so on. But it really is, in that sense, a fundamental and fascinating and disturbing transformation. How, and I'm getting to use the theme of the conference, how an accusation can seemingly be false, believed by a few people, dismissed by many people. And within what, a generation, 2 generations, it's an argument for elimination, massacre, killing. And then people come to adopt it for the very thing, they come to believe the very thing about themselves they're accused of, and it becomes their identity. So
in this case,
that's pretty quick. That's pretty quick.
That is, that encapsulates a lot of it. But what you're suggesting, or at least in this case, is that over time, the outgroup became to accept the label and then began to actually act in ways that were actually heretical.
Yes,
seeking
absolutely.
out persecution, seeking out martyrdom because it aligns their identity with others and solidifies their own sense that they're doing something right.
Yes. I mean, I should say there are still lots of people questioned by things like the Inquisitional who still don't get it and say, look, I'm not a bad person. But the disturbing thing is, outside that, but there are lots of people who, and of course I should say, and Christine can back me up better on this, we go from essentially just being an accusation often where there's very few, there's almost no name for people being accused. It's just you're a heretic. But by say 1300, the list gets longer and longer. And even by that stage, certainly you have the idea that Jews who go back to being Jews who've converted to Christendom and go back to being Jewish are heretics. We even have other arguments, and you famously you see it in Dante, but the Dominicans particularly say something like Jews and Muslims can now be defined as heretics because they've had the revelation of Christ, therefore they've turned their backs on it, therefore they're like heretics, therefore you start getting arguments, I would argue more powerfully arguments, that Jews can be eliminated in the same way heretics can be. And as I said, in Dante, of course, Muhammad's in the circle of heretics, right? Because he's fractured Christendom. So it becomes a way of understanding the world that spreads further and further out to understand everything, all time and space, I would argue. So it's an interesting question how, what, if you like, a conspiracy theory, so to speak, comes to encompass so much of the intellectual universe that these people are living in, and physical universe.
Professor Ames, just briefly, it does seem though that in this case, then the definition of who is and isn't part of the conspiracy is being made by the inquisitors. Essentially, the inquisitors are the ones in this case who are creating the sort of the fact of the conspiracies, and not necessarily the people in the groups themselves, until it gets to a point where it becomes part of their identity.
Yeah, I think one thing that is really important, I mean, Mark is absolutely correct that over time we see people who are being questioned start to take on this identity. I mean, some of them, as Mark says, not all of them, most of them don't do this, but some of them sort of grab onto this identity and say, yes, I'm a heretic. Exactly what you've been questioning me about, that's true. But one thing that is important is to make a really strong distinction, because I think I have a fruit fly running around in my office, sorry, why I haven't been in my office for 6 months. What we see is a really important distinction among medieval ecclesiastics between the sort of the people, the clerics who are writing these anti-heretical treatises early on, where it's like the sex orgies and the killing babies and all of that sort of lurid stuff. But what does happen when you start to see those actual inquisitorial trials ramp up is that inquisitors themselves, for most people, they say, oh, okay, it doesn't really sound like you've done very much. Okay, go off and say a prayer or something. And so what is important about that to me is thinking about the topic of our conversation here is that Inquisition means that persecution itself becomes a means to teach people about heresy, for one thing. But what we also see is they're not generally teaching people about these, again, lurid conspiracies, right? In actual inquisitorial trial transcripts, as opposed to those earlier treatises, we don't see inquisitors say, where was the sex orgy, right? Who was at the sex orgy? When did the babies die, etc. We do, again, see these much more banal things. Now, banality is still really important in terms of talking about medieval persecution. Absolutely. People are being burnt at the stake because of those fears that we talked about earlier. But you do have this really interesting contrast between the earlier conspiracy theories, but then when heresy knocks up against reality, the real world in inquisitorial trials, it kind of dissipates, which to me is a really important transhistorical lesson about the spread and then stopping particular conspiracy theories.
We will bring that point or surface that point a bit later. I want to continue this trend a little bit by asking Professor Douglas. We see today along these lines people conspicuously adopting beliefs they know are either against the grain, or they delight in being labeled a conspiracist, almost as if it's a badge of honor, a way of reinforcing their identity against whatever they're trying to fight, in the same way that then being told that they're wrong is for them part of that badge of honor. As long as people keep telling them, you're wrong, this is not to the dominant culture, the elites keep saying, you're wrong, this isn't true, this is dumb, what you're doing isn't true, for them, and being able to show that the elites have said that to them in sort of our social media realm, it seems to be a source of power for people who believes in these conspiracies. Professor Douglas, is that a phenomenon? Does this sort of complicate the notion that trying to deal with people in good faith, or does it complicate our notion of trying to deal with people in good faith? Because if being called wrong by the dominant culture or persecuted somehow is proof of the conspiracy, where do we go?
Yes, well, I think indeed it's extremely difficult, because I think once a person does believe extremely strongly in a conspiracy theory, then these beliefs are very, very important to people. So it's difficult to challenge those beliefs without either completely alienating a person or being seen as part of a conspiracy yourself, as the person who's is trying to convince this person otherwise. And you touched on a really interesting idea that people often use the term conspiracy theory, or I'm a conspiracy theorist, as sort of a badge of honor. And psychologically, I would argue that this is one of the reasons why conspiracy theories can appeal to people, because they might seem, even though it might not work, to fulfill a social need to, I guess, stand out from other people, to be different from others, to have some kind of unique knowledge that other people don't have. So in other words, there are certain psychological reasons why people might be drawn to conspiracy theories, and this is one of them, in that it kind of helps people to feel, or might give the illusion of feeling as though that they have unique knowledge that other people don't possess, so they can maintain this idea that they're somehow better than other people in a way. I mean, that's only one reason why people might be attracted to conspiracy theories. And again, as a social psychologist, I'm really interested in the psychological factors and social and economic factors and various other things, but in particular the psychological factors that attract people to conspiracy theories. And one of these is this social social, I guess, need that people have to feel good about themselves, and feeling that you have this knowledge is one way to try and kind of achieve that. But there are other psychological reasons why people are attracted to conspiracy theories as well, and one of them is obviously an epistemic need. People want to have knowledge, they want to feel certain. When something big happens, somehow a small explanation doesn't seem satisfactory, and a conspiracy often seems sort of more appealing. And people, you know, they're very uncertain. These situations are often very distressing. So conspiracy theories might seem to offer a simple answer to rather a large complex question, and might appear to resolve puzzles that are making people feel not very good. So, and people are predisposed to look for patterns. People are predisposed to try and connect the dots and look for patterns, even when they don't exist, because it's deeply uncomfortable to feel uncertain, and it's deeply uncomfortable to think that the world is a chaotic place. You want to have something more definitive, something to cling to, an answer. And conspiracy theories might be appealing for that sort of reason. So for those sort of, that kind of epistemic purpose. And I guess the other reason as well is that people might be drawn to conspiracy theories for, I guess, these more, I guess, what you call existential reasons. So people want to feel that they're safe, and they want to feel that they're secure. And when something big happens, there's a lot going on. Like, I always refer to the pandemic as an example. It's obvious, like, everybody's uncertain, everybody's feeling powerless and not very good right now. So conspiracy theories might seem to offer people, I don't know, some kind of feeling of safety, because at least that they have knowledge that helps them to understand why things are the way they are. And I've already talked about the social need as well, to kind of feel that you have unique knowledge. And of course, these psychological needs, they're often linked together. So for example, someone might be looking for patterns to try and get a sense of meaning in this chaotic kind of world, but also they're looking for patterns to try and satisfy a need for uniqueness compared to others. They want to find these patterns, they want to resolve these puzzles before other people do, because that makes them, or it's likely to make them feel a bit better compared to others. So, I mean, those are what I would argue are the psychological reasons why people are attracted to conspiracy theories. And in particular, in times of crisis and deep uncertainty, people are likely to experience these needs more. So these needs might be more frustrated at particular times compared to others. And people are looking for ways to cope, and conspiracy theories might seem appealing. Sadly, though, it doesn't seem that this is a strategy that actually works. There isn't a lot of research on this at the moment, but the research that does exist suggests that instead of making people feel better, believing in conspiracy theories can only further sort of frustrate those needs. And so people can get into a cycle of believing in conspiracy theories, and they're looking for these kinds of ways out of feeling unsafe and uncertain and trying to reduce that uncertainty, but then they turn to a conspiracy theory and it makes them feel more uncertain. So then they might turn to another conspiracy theory, and you can get into a kind of cycle.
It's like an addiction.
So yeah, I mean, that's the psychology of conspiracy theories in a nutshell, really.
But what it sounds from you is it's almost like become addicted to the pursuit of secret knowledge as a way of gaining control over, you know, an uncertain life, and that leads me to Professor Aral, the hype in the hype machine you talk about in 2013, this fake tweet of an AP story. There was allegedly an explosion at the White House, and President Obama was injured, and in this tweet, completely fake, but it had 4,000 retweets. And you write that it linked to an automatic trading algorithm that kind of traded off people's sentiment online, and $140 billion, I think it was, of profit equity was wiped out. In this instance, it seems that conspiracy theories were used deliberately for profit, and that human beings' emotions were manipulated for financial gain. Taking me back to some of the original questions I posed, in designing our online platforms in particular, have we essentially engineered in the permanent spread of conspiracy theories into the way that we relate to other human beings?
Well, I mean, I don't think any of it is permanent necessarily, but our current designs provide fertile ground for conspiracy theories and seem in lockstep with some of the social psychology and the history of conspiracies in general. So we did what at the time was the largest ever longitudinal study of the spread of fake news online, which we published in Science. And we studied all of the verified true and false news stories that ever spread on Twitter. And what we found was that the false stories spread farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information, sometimes by an order of magnitude. And false political stories were the most viral. And so this was shocking and scary, but it also raised an important scientific question, which is why? Why is falsity traveling so much farther? And our initial thought was, well, maybe false news spreaders have more followers, or maybe they follow more people, or maybe they're more often verified accounts, or they've been on Twitter longer. So we checked all of these in turn. And in fact, for every single case, the opposite was true. False news spreaders had fewer followers, followed fewer people, were less often verified, had been on Twitter for less time. So we had to seek an alternative explanation, which is something we call the novelty hypothesis, which is exactly what Karen is alluding to. We actually measured the novelty of the information compared to what people had seen in the 2 months prior to seeing a true or false news tweet. And we found that false news was way more novel than the truth, which makes sense because it's not constrained by reality. So it has a much larger space from which to draw. But if you read the cognitive science literature, you know that human attention is drawn to novelty because that's what is most likely to aid or change our opinions or our behaviors in a way that has an effect in the world. It's old information, redundant information that we already knew, doesn't affect our behavior or our decisions. So our brains have evolved to ignore it. There are classical examples of, the triangle with half the sides missing and your brain puts it together, or, the redundant information is sort of like sifted out and you focus on the novelty. And if you read the sociology literature, it's exactly the way that Karen is describing it, which is that we gain in status when we share novel information because it makes us look like we're in the know, or that we have access to some sort of inside information, and that people can come to us for information. So the way that the current platforms are designed is that they're based on an engagement economy, an attention economy. They engage us as much as possible in order to sell our attention to advertisers as opportunities to persuade us to buy products or vote for a particular political candidate. And so in a business model like that, which is why I call the book The Hype Machine, it's designed to hype us up because that's what drives profits, novelty reigns. And novelty reigns because we are more likely to share it, and because the algorithms are more likely to then favor that which is engaging and hyping. So it tends towards the extremes. And two other really important design elements of the modern information ecosystem make it a fertile ground for conspiracies. And that is the people you may know algorithms and the newsfeed algorithms. The people you may know algorithms recommend who you should connect to next in the network. And what they've found is that recommending friends of friends is a very computationally efficient way to make those algorithms run well from the perspective of the platforms. That just creates clusters of people who are like-minded being connected on social media. And the newsfeed algorithms are designed to give you more of what you like, more of what you engage with, read, click on, share, and so on. And these two things together create polarization because it puts us into clusters of like-minded people believing the same things, and it makes our feeds full of things that confirm our beliefs. And that means that we're rarely challenged, and we're rarely finding access to diverse information. And that, combined with the speed at which information moves, the favoring of novelty of the business models, and as well, the importance of social proof. So we have institutionalized and digitized social proof. in the likes, comments, shares, and even in social advertising, which legitimizes the beliefs in conspiracies. So if I see a conspiracy piece of information and it has many different likes from people in my community who have been essentially put together by an algorithm to make that community more like-minded and to favor that which is most hyping or engaging, these are technical enablers that create a fertile ground for conspiracies.
I'm tempted to ask you, based on what you just said, what you think is the best way that humans living in a modern society can re-engage their own agency and assert their autonomy here, given how powerful these factors act upon our brains without us being consciously aware of them.
Yeah, well, large-scale experiments show that people don't want to spread false information. They do it because they are not in a reflective or critical mode. When they're nudged to be reflective and then given experimentally false information, false news, they're less likely to believe it and less likely to share it. But the reason they share and believe it is because they're not thinking deeply. They're not in a sort of system two, in Danny Kahneman's words, cognitive style. They're in a system one cognitive style. And so they're just knee-jerk reacting to the information. So a couple of things come to mind. When you study the cognitive science of social media, what you find is a couple of things. First is the social brain hypothesis, that human beings evolved to process social signals from other human beings. And so the reason our neocortex is neocortex ratio, the ratio of our neocortex to the rest of the brain, one of the leading hypotheses to why that is so large in humans compared to other species is because of our sociality, our desire to process and communicate social information with other human beings. And the fact that these platforms were designed with the dopamine reward system in mind. I mean, you know, Sean Parker told Mike Allen in an interview in 2017 that, yeah, you know, we designed Facebook to give you little hits of dopamine every time you got a like, comment, or share on your content to keep you coming back for more. And all of these dopamine hits come on what is known as a random reinforcement schedule, which means that they could come at any moment. So we are always wondering, is my phone gonna buzz? Is it gonna light up? And our attention is always there, to the point where there's a documented syndrome of ghost vibrations of the phone, that people feel physical vibrations from their phone that don't even exist because our brain is so attuned to imagine the next dopamine hit coming. So an easy set of techniques is, number one, schedule your social media time, and then don't do it outside of that time. And when you're outside of that time, turn your notifications off so that you're not constantly on this variable reinforcement schedule waiting for the next dopamine hit. As a father of a young child, that might be easier said than done. Second, be reflective. So think before you think of social media as a space for critical thinking rather than as a space for knee-jerk reacting. Try to train yourself to be in system two instead of system one, and those kinds of things can help us in this area.
Mindfulness, a mindful pause between seeing something and then sharing it could mean the difference between one person acting on it and 5,000 people acting on it. And we don't necessarily have an intuition of digital physics in the way that we do, you know, an intuition of, you know, I can drop a phone and you would see what happened with gravity there. I want to open this discussion up to everyone in the panel. In our society, in our public sphere, and talking about the United States, but mainly the West, and I know that there are many other public spheres which conspiracy theories thrive, would they exist without a pervasive mistrust of official sources of information, however that came about? And are there lessons historically that we can use to think about how we rebuild confidence in official sources of information if we agree that they are valuable in and of themselves. I'll open this up to anybody who wants to give this a shot.
Do you mean distrust of government?
Distrust of government, distrust, for example, in the pandemic, problems of the way the government communicated information, but over time, a distrust of any major institution inside the United States, from the church to the government to schools. We just, sources of truth and sources of cohesion aren't there, and it gives it opens up the space for others to move in. Is there a way, or is there a way to combat that? Or again, are we on a slide to the point where we're truly atomized, and it just isn't helpful even to talk about official sources of information?
Well, I mean, I guess one thing that I would say is that in terms of conspiracy theories, there's never usually one single culprit who is responsible for all of these things. So conspiracy theories are extremely varied. They blame powerful groups, sometimes not so powerful groups, governments, pharmaceutical companies, people of particular religious persuasion. These groups are extremely varied. So to I guess try to get people to regain trust in authorities generally is maybe perhaps a little bit too broad, because the conspiracy theories are always so difficult and they're emerging all the time. So when you try to get rid of one conspiracy theory, then another one will pop up again, and you end up playing that game where you're constantly trying to knock one down. So a lot of psychologists, well, not a lot of psychologists, some psychologists at the moment are looking at, I guess, more general strategies for dealing with misinformation and conspiracy theories that don't necessarily deal with addressing a particular source. So I guess arming people with the idea that you need to, as Sinan was saying, take time, think critically, also warning people that information that they might come across could potentially be misleading. So like kind of almost in a way inoculating people against the idea that there might be something out there that's going to persuade them. So in other words, rather than dealing with the source, because the source is constantly changing, dealing with the bigger problem and how people process this information cognitively. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And actually, along those lines, so Professor Aral, if Facebook had found a way to scale up their content moderation and be able to show people who had spread misinformation that they had spread information, and been able to show them the effects of the spread of information, that is, the fact that I shared this meant that 4,000 other people, because of these network effects, also saw this misinformation that came because I shared this. Because of people's own sense of, well, I don't want to be the person to share misinformation. Is that the type of thing that a tech platform could have, again, architected into their system that might have helped reduce some of this spreading at scale?
Yes. So in a paper that was published yesterday in Nature so I run the initiative on the digital economy at MIT, and several researchers there published a paper in Nature yesterday. Dave Rand, Dean Eccles, Zibby Epstein, Gordon Pennycook, and one other author whose name I'm forgetting, did a fantastic study which showed that if you nudge people towards thinking about accuracy prior to, in the way that Karen is describing, prior to seeing any misinformation, it sort of inoculates them. So if every once in a while you just asked people, is the story you read just now true or false? It would prime them to think about the accuracy of what they were reading. And then when the false story came, several newsfeed items down the line, they're less likely to share it and less likely to believe it. So this opens the possibility to a system where you periodically ask people about the accuracy of the information that they are seeing. This not only primes them to be reflective, which reduces the belief in sharing of false news, but it crowdsources labels of falsity, which can then be used to train machine learning algorithms to label falsity more broadly. And one analogy I like to draw to the information ecosystem that we have today is that when you go to buy food at the grocery store, it's extensively labeled by law. You know how many calories it has, how many trans fats, if it was produced in a facility that produces wheat or peanuts if you have an allergy. But we have no such labels about the information that we consume, and information about the provenance of it, or the historical track record of veracity of the source, or what is the editorial policy of the source, and so on. None of that comes with the information we consume today. And so you can imagine a system that crowdsources labels of misinformation, that periodically nudges people at the same time with the same questions to be reflective of the information that they're seeing, and then plugs that into a human in the loop machine learning system that then propagates labels, nudges for accuracy, collects labels from the crowd, determines the weight of each crowdsourced individual, how accurate they typically tend to be, weights them more, and so on. And these are scalable solutions. And by the way, we need scalable solutions because other experiments show that when you start labeling misinformation, people assume that the things that you don't label are true. So once you start labeling, you have to label everything, because everything that you don't label is assumed to be true. So you truly need a system that scales for it to be solvent.
This leads me to, go ahead.
Sorry, could I add something really quickly?
Yes, please.
I think thinking historically, one of the things that really complicates this discussion and the comparison between medieval and modern, especially in talking about heresy, is one could very easily argue that a sense of intellectual or informational consensus is the same thing as orthodoxy. And if it is the case that the medieval ecclesiastics that Mark and I study, if we think of them as the ones who were disseminating conspiracy theories about heresy in the Middle Ages, they were the intellectual elite. They were the people with power. They were the people on top. And we haven't talked about power very much in our session, about the relationships between power and information. But that's something that I think is sort of deeply sort of problematic and hard to think about, because if we're talking about the very idea of labeling information, right, and authorizing information and authorizing truth, that's what Mark and I see in the inquisitors and ecclesiastics that we study. And so I'll say, for me as a medievalist, in some ways it's both fascinating, but also a little bit worrying to think about a modern dynamic, right, of authorizing truth. Again, because that's what my Christian inquisitors did. They authorized truth among communities, and then those communities pushed back and said, who are you, intellectual elite, to authorize truth? And so I think, again, that is a really, really difficult comparison and a really difficult thing to think about.
I think some of the problems that fact checkers have had in gaining traction has to do with this very dynamic, which is that people see them as part of the elite. And therefore, any of these approaches that may seem technocratic are just approaches that are designed to suppress ourselves, or our,
Can I just quickly...
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
I just want to quickly come in also on Christine and on these. I mean, isn't also part of the problem here what you're getting at? And let's use America as an example, because that's clearly where sort of, we could even say our psychological models come very much from an understanding of modern Western people and certainly Americans. Isn't it, where are the sources of authority, or where are the sources of truth? And if we're using, say, a medieval model, which is where we're talking about overtly a society fundamentally shaped by religion, right? Let's just say the pre-modern world. That seems a pretty obvious statement. One could argue 19th century Western societies as a mixture of secularization and religion, also had these two conflicting notions of where truth may come from. And you could see that conspiracies, whether they be in countries like France or Germany or so forth and so on, was part of this conflict between secularization and a more overtly religious model. What I think is disturbing about America, and I think it is, or at least is an exceptional modern phenomenon, it's unquestionably the most religious country, Western country, which I do think means you have this really conflicting notions of where truth can come from. And I'm not about to say religion's a conspiracy, that's not what I'm arguing. But the fact about religion is it can never be disproved, right? It is something that you believe. It is something that no matter what is said, even no matter whatever facts you say, bring out, it can never be disproved. That's in many ways, if you like, seduction and the sort of the beauty of religion. I'm not a religious person, by the way. But fundamentally, when we're talking about governments or we're talking about other authorities, we technically assume they can be disproved, right? We can label when a congressman says something wrong, or when the government gets something wrong about drugs, or we want them so forth and so on. And yet I do feel, particularly when we're talking about, say, the world living in now, I do think there's this powerful conflict here. I think it has, fundamentally it is, I do think much of the religious basis of America, I think, causes some of this. And I think it's interesting how much it's often been left out, how deeply Christian was so many say the people who attacked the Capitol, and how often they talked about God and Christ, and how Christian was a QAnon phenomenon, but also it also spreads in other religions. But I generally think part of the religiosity of American society, where it actually has followed a very distinctly different path than other Western liberal democracies, I do think has led to much of the huge doubt about truth within this country. Now, we don't have to blame, one could therefore blame the academy for lacking of truth too, but I do think that to me seems profound, because when we talk about doubting about governments, we could just go back to Roosevelt and Depression. There was a powerful idea that government you trusted would save you. Now, there were still Republican doubters, but then we get to the 80s with Reagan, and what is the famous line, I'm from the government, and so forth and so on. Then we have a deep distrust in the black helicopters and so forth and so on. And I generally think there's something, I guess this is where I'm a historian, there's something powerfully unique, specific, contingent about conspiracies in America, about doubting truth, that is distinctly to this society of the last, say, 30 or 40 years, that I do think led us to the point we got to, not just with the election of President Trump, but I even think with the attack on the Capitol.
Professor Aral, I want to get to you in.
I know, but I'm just saying, I'm just not totally convinced having more labels on truth information is going to stop that.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Let me complicate that even further just a little bit. There are cultures within America who have reason to not be trustful of the government in any situation. Women, people of color, who have been, even we're seeing, for example, in some of the, for example, the vaccine hesitancy, which is a fascinating phenomenon on the far right, Republicans, and among certain non-dominant groups who have similar reasons, although for coming at it very differently, to mistrust official sources of authority, because have been in the past misled. But incidentally, the study that you talked about, Professor Aral, I've sent a link to Erica, and I'll have Erica send that to the rest. But I'd love to just get your not rejoinder, but your thoughts on what we've just heard. Is how do we address some of the complications about how we find the truth here, and who's going to believe the truth?
Well, I mean, two things, actually, three things. One is that I sort of believe that, there's a moniker that goes around, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. I think there are certain things that we can hopefully largely agree on. And I do believe that when it comes to thinking about theories of human decision-making, human cooperation, human collaboration. Truth is at the center of all of those theories. An accurate set of information about the realities on the ground, whether it's, you know, the relationship between emission of carbon dioxide and climate change, or whether it is the science of the risks associated with vaccines and its relationship to autism and so on and so forth. I do think it's essential to get to a bedrock understanding of what is real and what isn't real. But as I describe in my book, and you might not be expecting me to, but to agree with Christine completely, who gets to decide what's true and what's false is not a technical question. It's not a question of algorithms and platform design. It's a deeply philosophical and ethical question, and it completely, is wrapped up in power. As somebody who is a big fan of Michel Foucault and many other authors who understands the depth of that very short comment that she made, which I think is spot on. It gets to the notion of, who are the fact checkers and who's checking the fact checkers and who should have the right to decide. Is it Facebook that should have the right to label, or do we want governments doing the labeling? And wow, each of those is incredibly problematic. But I think I can say both of those two things simultaneously. I can say that the bedrock fundamental factual truth of certain things is essential to our society's functioning in terms of collaboration, coordination, negotiation, and so on, and that labeling truth is very hard, fraught with power dynamics, difficult, complex, and so on. And just to bring it back to a part of a conversation we were having earlier, someone brought up, I think it was Christine, that there was a targeted line in the heretical discourse, which was that you will harm others in society. And that brings us full circle to the vaccine hesitancy debate, right? Because your vaccine choices affect not just yourself. It's not just about whether the vaccine is going to cause autism in you or prevent the coronavirus in you. It's about the degree to which we can get a handle on the coronavirus in the trajectory of the pandemic, and whether my son will get coronavirus, right? And so we have these collective problems where our opinions, behaviors, and decisions are interdependent. And so in an environment like that, I think we have to think about what elements of, where do we draw the line between opinion and fact, in what disciplines and areas and bodies of knowledge is it important to create a bedrock understanding of the truth, to support human collaboration, cooperation, decision-making, and so on. And then at the same time and simultaneously, really tackle the very thorny and challenging problem of who gets to decide what's true and what's false, and all of the power dynamics that go along with that.
Unfortunately, time is not a conspiracy. And our time is up, but truly, this has been a fascinating and illuminating and mind-expanding conversation for me. Professor Sinan Aral, Professor Christine Caldwell Ames, Professor Karen Douglas, Professor Mark Gregory Pegg, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mark Amateur of the Center for Communication Leadership Policy at Annenberg. Please, everyone, get vaccinated when you can, and have a safe day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.